Welcome back to the show.
David, how's it going?
It's going pretty good, and it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, first of all, I'm rattling off the titles to all these amazing books, and you've got two that we can be talking about now, but you also happen to have a third one that's also coming out, and that is, what is it, Weird World? Is that something like that? The world's weirdest places.
Yeah, it's basically the publisher. What often happens is the publisher, rather than me come up with the ideas, the publisher themselves actually come up with the ideas for the books. And they said, they were looking to have. They do like a series of books. They did the world's creepiest places and the world's most haunted places. And they asked me if I wanted to do the world's weirdest. And so basically, it's a study of 25 places around the world that are sort of like a magnet for just weird activity. In other words, it's not a weird place because somebody happened to see Bigfoot there once. But if somebody saw Bigfoot, somebody else had a UFO encounter, there's a famous 3 or 4 ghost stories, there's something else, to where the place itself is like the beacon for strangeness. That's the theme of the book, sort of 25 places around the world where, there's just never-ending strangeness going on. And that one will be out round about October, I think, something like that.
That's just amazing. I mean, so they actually give you the ideas for the books, or all the time, or are there some books particularly that you say I have to write?
Yeah, I mean, the Men in Black mystery, that's one that really sort of fascinates me, and I've written a couple of books about that and working on another one, and so that was one that I came up with. But, I mean, I'd say it's probably 50-50, where, I probably submit to publishers every year, probably somewhere in the region of like 10 or 15 book ideas. And of those book ideas, probably 2 or 3 get accepted. And then they sort of toss their ideas back and forth, and I send my suggestions back. We kind of bang it into shape. It's kind of like a band recording 20 songs for their album, and then they trim it down to 12. It's kind of like that sort of thing, that you go with the ideas that seem best, and where I have sort of several criteria when writing a book. You don't want to, even if you're doing something like an old mystery, you don't want to go over old ground. You want to be able to give the reader something new. I don't want people to pick a book up and say, well, hang on, I've just read all this, condensed from 15 different books. You want to be able to give them new data, even if, like with the Men in Black, it's an old mystery. So that's one of the things. And also, you just want to try and stay fresh, and uncover new cases and material. So, don't just go over old cases but with a new theme, but actually, sort of dig out new stuff. That's why, I don't kind of do like the A to Z of abductions, because what are you going to do? Just reel off all the cases that are already in print anyway, It's like, what's the point?
So how long now have you been writing?
I actually started in 1982. Which was, scarily enough, 30 years ago this year. I'm 47 now, and I started at 17. And basically what happened was I was pretty much useless at school. I was one of these kids that, I was great, having a great time with all my friends and whatever, but, when it came to lessons and class, I was not the greatest student at all, and didn't get good grades, nothing like that at all. No college, university for me. I just left at 17, typical, me and all my friends were sort of like, the typical gang on the streets, you know what I mean? What are we going to do? You've got to find something to do. And I went down what in England at the time called the job centres, where all the jobs are advertised. And I had no clue what I wanted to do. But there was a new magazine starting up, not too far from where I live, called Zero. And it was basically going to be a magazine for teenagers, covering everything like music, fashion, TV, all sorts of things, that would sort of appeal to teenagers. And it said, no experience necessary, we'll train you in every aspect of journalism, photography, page layout, design, interview techniques. And I thought, well, this sounds much better than pushing buttons in a factory or, being told what to do all day long and getting stuck in traffic on the way to work, because it was literally just like a mile from where I lived. so, I thought, well, this sounds like a good job, and it sounded an interesting and alternative job, and so I did that, went along for the job application, actually got the job, amazingly, and did that for about 2 years, and then I thought afterwards, when the job came to an end, because it was like a limited contract run, I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And for a few years, I just went back to sort of regular jobs because I just couldn't, I was still like young and green, and I just didn't make much of an inroad into the world of journalism. I just went back to sort of regular sort of like warehouse work, forklift driving, van driving, did that for sort of 4 or 5 years, but still did freelance writing during that period. And then as I got more and more leads and inroads and networking with people, I got to the point where I thought, well, hang on a minute, I'm actually now starting to be able to do this as a career. Granted, even, back then and even today, not like some people think, you're living in the Hollywood Hills with a Ferrari or whatever, you got to, freelance writing is a tough, struggling world to be in, it's fun, you're your own boss, but, no one's ever going to get rich off it unless you're really, J.K. Rowling or Stephen King. But I enjoy what I do, and that's always been the case. So I started off from there, doing more and more work and in all sorts of fields, which I still do today. I don't just do paranormal writing. When you're a writer, it's kind of, again, to make like a band analogy, if somebody wants to book you for a gig, you go where the gig is, so and that's what I've done all that time,
right.
Basically. So.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how you can tie Bigfoot into Penthouse magazine, but...
Oh, well, you have to be very skillful. I mean, I actually did quite a bit of writing for Penthouse. I did quite a bit of feature writing for them on all sorts of things. But basically, some of the stuff I did for Penthouse, I did a sort of a lengthy article from about 2 years ago called Sex and the Supernatural, which was basically like a study of people who claim to have had like sexual type encounters with ghosts and paranormal entities, kind of like incubus and succubus type stories, that kind of thing. It was like a sexual component, not, sort of hot babes coming back from the dead or anything like that, but unfortunately, but no, it's more along the lines of, sort of the paranormal aspects of when people talk about these kind of, experiences, etc.
So since you've been writing all this time, and since you started, and particularly since you started writing about the paranormal, and from that point till now, describe for me what is your feeling about, and what kind of change, well, first of all, how has it changed you?
Well, I'm not sure it's changed me. I think it's probably given me obviously more of an appreciation that the world around us, that there's far more to it than we think there is. It's not just sort of black and white. You get up, you go to work, you come home, you watch TV, and go to bed. There's, there are sort of realms and forces and dimensions, however you want to term it. There's things around us that sort of exist on the fringes of society that would become classed as the paranormal or the supernatural. And, I'm firmly convinced they exist. So I think rather than change me, it's given me an appreciation that there's more to be found than just what we see in front of us. But I think in terms of change, there have been changes. I mean, in one sense, that when I first got involved, for example, in the UFO field, UFOs, when I was sort of 11, 12 as a kid, UFOs were alien spacecraft and et cetera, but the more I've kind of dug into it, I'm pretty much more convinced nowadays that rather being literally sort of extraterrestrial, these entities, whatever they are, possibly more likely to coexist with us in kind of like extra or interdimensional windows, that kind of thing. Now, that doesn't, by definition, they're still alien in the sense that they're non-human, but I kind of take the view that, there seems to be a lot of parallels with, ancient mythology and folklore of like supernatural entities coming through gateways and doorways, some other magical realms to our existence. And back then they were viewed as like goblins and pixies and whatever, and now today we put like an alien spin on them. But I sometimes wonder if nobody, whether it's in the 1500s, the 8th century or today, if we actually have a full understanding of what these entities are, but other than the fact that they're coming from somewhere else and they interact with us. And it's kind of the same with Bigfoot, and that's my other big interest is cryptozoology, the study of unknown animals. Again, when I first got into it, I just thought, well, Bigfoot's just some sort of ape that science hasn't classified or identified yet. But there are a lot of weird Bigfoot-type cases as well, like Bigfoot vanishing in the flash of light, or footprints suddenly coming to a halt as if, the creature had just disappeared. There are stories about cameras, malfunctioning when people try and photograph these things. And again, I'm more inclined to think today that Bigfoot and all these different cryptids, that's what they call the unknown animals, all of these things seem to be tied in. There are a lot of UFO cases where Bigfoot and other creatures are being seen not just at the same place, but at the same time. So I kind of, today, think there's like a bigger picture that's where all these, quote, things, if you like, which is the best way to describe them, kind of fall into different aspects of a larger phenomenon that we're still struggling to get to grips with. So in other words, I don't think I've changed as a person, but certainly my views have changed over the years the more I've dug into all this.
Since we're talking about cryptids, just a question that just came into my mind about Nessie, of course. Do you believe that that's an actual, do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster, or have you done any research into that?
Oh, yeah, I've been to Loch Ness. I mean, when I used to live in England, Britain itself is actually quite a small country. I mean, right now I live just outside Dallas, Texas. England, Scotland, and Wales combined are actually smaller than the entire state of Texas. That's how small the British Isles is.
Yeah.
So, in other words, travelling from England to Loch Ness, Scotland, actually is no different from sort of, taking a trip from like LA to San Francisco. You can do it in a day or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, Loch Ness is a cool place to hang out. And, I do believe that, there's a phenomenon that has become known as the Loch Ness Monster. What it is, I mean, that's the big question. Some people suggest the idea of a surviving plesiosaur, a Jurassic, basically a prehistoric reptile. I mean, it's an interesting theory. The only problems are that, plesiosaurs were saltwater animals. They lived in the oceans. Loch Ness is freshwater. Loch Ness, some people have said, well, these creatures look to be sort of 15 to 20 feet long. And if they're flesh eaters, is there a viable enough fish population in Loch Ness to survive a colony of animals, maybe 20 or 30, of 20 to 30 feet long, possibly, and is there enough fish to feed them every day? It's sort of these critical questions that, even for me, push some of the Loch Ness stories again down the paranormal path. I mean, Loch Ness is a very weird place. I mean, none other than Aleister Crowley actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which was actually later owned by Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. And Crowley actually did all sorts of various incantations to summon up demons. There have been UFO encounters over Loch Ness, Men in Black encounters even on the shore of Loch Ness, sightings of sort of large, weird-looking black cats. You name it. There's been ghost encounters. Again, Loch Ness is like a beacon for weird activity. So if it was just the Loch Ness Monster, I'd be inclined to say, well, yeah, maybe it's some sort of surviving creature from the past. But tying it in with all this other stuff, and again, you have to wonder, because there are also cases of people trying to photograph the Loch Ness Monster and their cameras jam at the crucial moments. It is almost like, you're dealing with a creature that seems flesh and blood, but on the other hand, seems to have like paranormal overtones to it as well.
It does seem amazing that people somehow can never really come out with a clear picture of, these, cryptozoological creatures. When what they described they saw, it seems very plausible for the most part, and they're very sure about it, but somehow that they never really come out with that definitive picture. Do you think we're going to ever get to see, do you think this question is going to be resolved, say, in our lifetime?
Well, I mean, I would hope so, but I think, you can look back at not just through the UFO field, which began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold. I'm sure young guys and women then who sort of set up UFO clubs in the early 50s were sure they were going to get the answer in the 60s, you know. Most of those people aren't left anymore now, sort of 60 years. And not to sound depressive, you know, but it's just a fact. You know, 60 years later, there aren't many of them left. 100 years ago, you know, people were engaging in things like seances to contact the dead. People are still doing that today because we don't really have the answers. So I would like to think we're going to get the answer, but if you ask me honestly, if we look at the trend that's gone on in the past, these mysteries have perpetuated and, you know, the human lifespan hasn't, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of it is going to be dependent on persistence, you know. If we don't continue looking, searching and, you know, going on these quests, I know for sure we won't get the answers. But I think it's going to take some sort of alternative thinking or... one of the things I've found is that if you just investigate stuff, you end up with a lot of files, a lot of research, you know, a lot of you know, certainly files and filing cabinets 20 years ago. Today, you know, endless amounts of memory space taken up and CDs, you know, to save all your files on, or thumb drives or whatever. But and reports are good. You know, there's nothing more important in the subject than the witnesses. You know, these are the most important people. But just investigating stuff and collating stuff isn't enough. I've found that you really need to try and experience the phenomena for yourself to try and get the answers. And I think that's an important thing. Don't just be an investigator if you want to find the truth. You've got to become part of interacting with the phenomenon if you can.
Well, now that's a tough question, because how does one, you know, do that? Let's take you, for instance. Now, you've been doing this for a while. What has, if you don't mind sharing, what's been the most paranormal experience that you've had?
Well, I mean, I'll give you a good example, David. I mean, one of the areas that interests me a lot is the subject of tulpas. I don't know if you know what tulpas are or if your audience does, but basically a tulpa is the idea that you imagine that, you know, you focus in your mind on an image. It's actually a Tibetan term, tulpa. You imagine you focus in your mind on one particular image. Let's say a large black cat with glowing red eyes, like a 7-foot-tall supernatural black cat with glowing red eyes. You focus on that image in your mind day in, day out. You even get yourself in like a meditative, altered state, and you just focus on this image, and it grows stronger in your mind day by day, and it becomes sort of nurtured to where it creates like a, you know, in your mind at least, it's like a semi-real creation. And then, you know, the following week, after months and months of doing this, you pick up your local newspaper, and somebody has seen, you know, just 10 yards down the road from your house, this large black cat with glowing red eyes running across the road. Basically, the idea is of tulpas is that the human mind can sort of create and externalize creations of the mind. In other words, what you imagine can actually come to life, not in literal flesh and blood terms, but you can sort of externalize almost like a holographic type of thing from your brain. And what's more interesting is that the more that people see it and believe in it, it sort of adds vitality to the entity to where it becomes like a semi-quasi-self-aware thing. It's almost like giving birth to a monster of the mind. And I've actually sort of engaged in a lot of these type of things to try and create tulpas. And I've had a couple of very weird experiences where I've focused intently on things and done sort of meditative things to try and really focus on this imagery. Almost, and literally to have on a couple of occasions, and almost on others where there are aspects of it floating around, of people seeing some of the things that I was trying to focus on. And it's like the more that people then see them, other people see them. And this is one of the theories about the tulpa, is that they survive by sort of thriving on human energy, and particularly fear. So in other words, maybe some of these things they're seeing because they need to be seen to sort of psychically feed and bleed on the energy, kind of like a psychic vampire, you know, instead of the classic vampire drinking blood, you know, these things appear for people. You know, people say, well, why do they keep appearing, you know, when somebody's driving down the road late at night and the person gets scared? Well, maybe that's the whole point, that they soak up that energy, and it gives this sort of quasi life form more energy and more vitality. So, I've had a few experiences like that. And, if you look up Tulpa, Tulpa on Google or whatever, it's a fascinating, granted it's a theory, but it's a fascinating theory that, maybe some of these things exist because we believe in them. And the more we believe in them, the more they exist.
So you're saying essentially that it's a thought creation. Now, I know that you touch upon the Mothman in your latest, in the book, The Men in Black. Do you think the Men in Black is, the Mothman is a tulpa? Or do you feel that was something more substantial?
I don't think Mothman's a tulpa. I think the very term Mothman sort of provokes this idea that it's one particular entity and that's it. But the fact is that, if you go back through, not just throughout history, but throughout pretty much every culture around the world, they have stories of sort of supernatural winged creatures. For example, the Native American Indians talk about the Thunderbird. England has a very, very similar creature to Mothman, even down to the glowing red eyes. It's known as Owlman. You have the Mothman in the United States. Countless cultures have stories and legends of gargoyles, sort of humanoid creatures with wings. So in other words, you can go, harpies, that's another one from ancient Greece. So in other words, you can go through pretty much every culture and they have these sort of semi-humanoid winged creatures sort of flying around and interacting with people. Some have sort of are perceived as being positive, others are sort of negative and malevolent. And I think Mothman was, in the 60s, was the then sort of latest aspect of this phenomenon. And again, one of the reasons why I'm sort of more inclined to go down like an interdimensional path is that these things come and go. It's like 1 minute they're here, then they're gone for a couple of years, and they suddenly appear again, and they bring with them a wide range of other strangeness. Point Pleasant, where Mothman appeared in the 60s, was a hotbed for UFO activity, poltergeist activity, Men in Black sightings. It was almost, again, like a doorway opened, and all this weirdness came piling through, and then, the doorway was suddenly closed, and they were gone again. So I'm more inclined to, view Mothman as some sort of inhabitant of another realm. Now, things like quantum physics today, are actually allowing for the existence of far more than like our conventional three.
I'm still here, and I think Nick will be back in a second. I think there was just a brief little...
Am I back?
You are back. Go right ahead and say whatever it was you were saying.
Well, sure. I was just going to say about dimensions and things like that, the easiest analogy is like a radio in your car. You're driving along and you've got one channel on, you don't like the song, so you tune it into another, and then another, and another. Now, all these channels and all these shows are going on at the same time, but you can only be tuned into one at any given moment. And I think that's how I kind of view the paranormal and the supernatural, that, there are coexisting multi-dimensions, and if you know how to access the other ones, you can zip in and out. But you can, we only see one at any given time. And maybe when these things appear, it's because the doorway between this dimension and another has been opened in the same way as, tuning your radio from one station to another. So.
Do you think that, the sightings of the Mothman in Point Pleasant sort of reached a peak when the bridge was destroyed? And do you think maybe that, and this was my theory when I was really kind of getting into studying that, is that maybe, powers that be decided that so much attention was being brought to this creature that the destruction of the bridge and that loss of life sort of turned the town's attention to other things. All of a sudden they had to stop thinking about this creature, and they had to start, coming out of this tragedy and surviving. And for me, it was almost like a deterrent, something to keep them off from going any further with what they were doing. Do you think that's a possibility, or am I just, what do you think about that?
Well, it's a possibility. When it comes to stuff like Mothman, a glowing-eyed winged humanoid flying around, anything's possible. The interesting thing about Mothman is that there are a number of theories. A lot of people assume that because this sort of glowing-eyed, slightly ominous-looking, shadowy creature appeared before, the bridge collapsed, and that was sort of the culmination of sightings, that Mothman was the cause of it. Other people view Mothman as kind of like not as a Grim Reaper, but like as a creature that appears before disaster to try and warn people of impending disaster. In other words, it's perceived by some people as being the cause, but other people view it as like a warning sign, to keep a lookout. And what's interesting is that, if you look into every culture around the world, there is not a single culture that does not have a folklore of paranormal activity occurring in the vicinity of bridges. If you type in paranormal plus bridge, for example, where I'm from, I grew up in central England, and a lot of it was kind of like, heavily forested and wooded, and not too far away, there was a large canal called the Shropshire Union Canal. One of the bridges over the canal, sort of very heavily forested, and just like it had a huge tree canopy all around it, was the site in the 1800s of a Bigfoot-type creature. Here, where I live now, if I drive north for about an hour to the little town of Denton, they have a legend that the local bridge in town is haunted by a creature known as the Goatman. And, you can find bridge stories. That's where, the story of the troll and the three billy goats and the bridge,
right.
That's where that story comes from. It's because bridges attract paranormal activity. Now, why that should be the case, I don't know. But, Mothman, again, is probably the definitive example of that.
What is Men in Black, or how did Men in Black figure into the Mothman incident?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is like a classic example of how we get John Keel kind of coined the term window areas. That's to say, where one particular area it just goes insane, because I don't mean the people go insane, but I mean insane in terms of the sheer level of weirdness. Now, Mothman, although there was actually one sighting in 1961 of a Mothman-type creature in town, it really didn't kick off until sort of 65, 66, 67. That was sort of the culmination. But people began also reporting seeing UFOs and strange lights in the sky. They talked about meetings or seeing, having sort of contactee and abduction type encounters late at night on the roads around town. People reported poltergeist activity in the home. And then sort of lo and behold, you had these menacing Men in Black turn up. Now, one of the things I talk about in my book, The Real Men in Black, is that there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there are two categories of Men in Black. There are the government people who, investigate UFOs and want to keep people quiet and dress in, sort of government clothing, black suits, etc. But there's a weirder category which seem to have far more paranormal origins. These are sort of white, pasty, pale, skinny guys who seem out of place and out of time in terms of clothing and mannerisms. And these were the ones that turned up at Point Pleasant. They come across almost as like vampires upgraded for the 21st century. And 20th century. I don't mean sort of true blood type vampires or underworld vampires. I mean, sort of the cadaver type vampires of the past, but, given a new suit, hat, and, black car rather than cloak and riding on the back of a black horse or whatever. And the Men in Black turned up asking all sorts of questions about UFO activity and Mothman and sort of offering vague threats to people, you won't talk about this and what do you think will happen to you if you do talk, sort of those veiled type things. And but the interesting thing is that everything pretty much came to a halt when Mothman went away. When the Mothman went, everything else subsided as well, including the Men in Black.
All right, one quick question aside. Point Pleasant's pretty much back to normal now. Then, it's from what you know. It is.
Things
are quieted down.
What I would say, it is, and it has, and there hasn't been like a huge wave of Mothman sightings since '67. But what I can tell with absolute certainty is that there have been periodic sightings of Mothman-type creatures in Point Pleasant, pretty much up until very, very recent years, if not the present day. 65, 66, 67, you could not pick up the newspaper without a new report. Now we're talking maybe one or two reports a year, but little known fact, people still see Mothman around Point Pleasant. And every year, they now have sort of like a celebration that kind of sort of pays homage to Mothman. It's like a little local town sort of festival type situation. So, the town sort of has embraced it, and, it's become sort of like a tourist thing as well now.
Yeah, well, that's the amazing thing about us humans. We just, we'll make it work one way or the other. So, you're saying, though, that, because I think most people tend to think of the Men in Black, of course, as being government agents. I mean, the film Men in Black, and there's been 3 of them, and by the way, the last one's really pretty good, people. But nevertheless, because the government was involved. I mean, the government, from what I understand, the government was involved in what happened in Point Pleasant. But in addition to the government being involved, then along come these other stranger beings as well, and they've got their own agenda. What do you think their agenda is?
Well, again, I mean, this is the big question. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, certainly back in the 50s and 60s, when people like the FBI, they wore like the standard black suit, black tie, and the fedora, Homburg type hats, and that's but all the guys wore, in the US, all the guys wore that sort of outfit then. It was kind of the cool way to look. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was either that or you were like a greaser or whatever. Do you know what I mean? In the Bronx, that sort of thing. Those are sort of the two. You're either the cool-looking guy in the seats or the cool guy in the T-shirt and the motorbike. And so people who got visits from government agents got visits from guys in black hats and black suits who were pretty stern and said, don't talk about this UFO sighting or whatever, because they were part of sort of clandestine organizations in the military or the government that didn't want the truth about UFOs, or what the government knew about it at least, coming out. And certainly part of the Men in Black mystery and history is born out or born from that whole era and the government investigations. And, that certainly the Men in Black movies and the comic book series that the movies were based on followed that approach, that it's all based around a particular agency of government. Now, I don't dispute at all that this is a significant angle of the mystery. It is. But if you go back to the early years of when the Men in Black puzzle really kicked off, in the early 1950s. Actually didn't kick off in 47 as such with Kenneth Arnold. It kicked off in early 50s with a man named Albert Bender, who set up a UFO research group in Bridgeport, Connecticut, called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He was the first guy, really, to sort of get visited by the Men in Black. But if you read Bender's story, it sounds nothing like the X-Files. It sounds like, Bender as a UFO investigator, immersed in some sort of H.P. Lovecraft horror gothic story where these entities would sort of manifest in his bedroom amid like a smell of brimstone, and he would sort of go into like a semi-altered state where they would sort of basically speak to him in his mind, and he would sort of go to the cinema like late on a Saturday night, and on his way home he would see these sort of shadowy figures manifesting out the alleyways and the old streets, and it literally does come across, like as I said, like an H.P. Lovecraft type story that has so far removed from the whole UFO subject, that you couldn't imagine, and it sounds more like Bender got mixed up with sort of predatory, demonic, negative entities that wanted to get their claws into him, but that appeared in the form of sort of black-dressed or darkly dressed, menacing, white-faced characters. And what's interesting is that a lot of the old early Men in Black stories, people think back to the movies, and they think, well, you've seen a UFO, the Men in Black knock on the door, they're going to kick your door down and burst in and threaten you. They don't. The Men in Black never, in the early years, never entered anybody's homes until they got an invite, which is like the old vampire stories, that they can't enter your home until you invite them in, And so, and if you go back and read the original books, all the Men in Black, they weren't like big built agent guys of the government. They were like 6 foot tall, or anyway, actually between 5 and 6 feet tall, but looking emaciated, almost anorexic, anemic, didn't seem very conversant with our ways and mannerisms. Their clothes hung on them. They asked the weirdest questions, and a lot of the people they turned up for in the UFO field were also defined by the fact that many of them were used as Ouija boards. They were actually into the occult. People who just had regular jobs and into ufology didn't often get the visit. People who were digging into seances, Ouija boards, paranormal stuff, as well as UFOs, they got the visit from the weirder MIB.
That's really interesting. Is it possible that now that we've got this sort of, how would I call it, this concept of this Men in Black idea, that maybe it's being used by the government and maybe it's being used by a variety of different entities with different purposes?
Oh, yeah, I actually believe
as opposed,
that.
Yeah, as opposed to just being like, okay, well, these are the Men in Black, and they're here from another dimension, or they're here for. No, they might be from. They might be totally unrelated to another group of Men in Black. I don't know, but I mean, again,
actually, I think you're 100% right. I mean, this is one of the things I talk about in The Real Men in Black book, is that I'm firmly convinced that what happened is that in the late 40s, early 50s, a lot of UFO researchers like Albert Bender got visited by these far more paranormal-like Men in Black, but this coincided with the government, or elements of the government, wanting to silence people in terms of ufology and not uncover the truth about the subject. So what's the best thing to do? Well, the government, even by its own admission, we've got files now, knew that there were these weirder Men in Black running around. So what better way, if you're the government or an agency, what better way to cover your tracks than to masquerade as these stranger MIB? Don't turn up flashing an ID card of Colonel Smith from the local base, because somebody's going to track you down immediately and tell the press, and then the story's going to blow open. If you get your guys to dress like these weirder MIB, even if the government really didn't know who the weirder ones were, they would still be astute enough to realize it would act as a good cover. And I think that's what happened. The government may not even really know who these strange MIB are, but they do know that if they want to cover their tracks, impersonating them is the perfect way to do it.
I wonder, if the real MIB have actually, appeared to the government, officials themselves, and I would love to know what that conversation went like.
Yeah. Well, what I can tell you, it's one of the things I did when I was researching the Real Men in Black book was to use the Freedom of Information Act to try and get files on some of the early players in the UFO field. And actually I got hold of Albert Bender, who set up this group in the early 50s. I got hold of his FBI file. The FBI watched him quite closely. What's interesting is that in 1956, none other than J. Edgar Hoover himself, and these files are actually in the public domain now and in the book, these files actually show how Hoover actually ordered one of his agents in 56 to go out and buy a copy of the first book on the Men in Black, which was published in 56. It was called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, written by a guy named Gray Barker. And Hoover ordered one of his agents to go out and purchase a copy. So, to have the director of the FBI, as far back as 56, interested in the Men in Black mystery, there's got to be more going on behind the scenes to where people in government were taking an interest and knew this was a real phenomenon. But, I think sometimes we give government agencies too much credit that they have all the answers. I think the ironic thing is, from looking at all these files, etc., that what was actually going on, that there were people in government actually sitting around tables saying, everybody thinks the government's the Men in Black, and then you have government people sitting around a table saying, who the hell are the Men in Black? It's kind of like that they knew there was a phenomenon, but even they weren't really sure what was going on, I don't think.
Have you seen the video on YouTube? I think it was from Canada, where the Men in Black were two guys coming through the door dressed identically, came in to look. Did you see that video?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting. It's controversial. Somebody said it's a hoax, other people said it's real. But the way they look, what I can say is that the way they look in that film, sort of stern, sort of almost, eerily stern, and they all are just looking totally out of place. That is exactly how the real Men in Black look. They're not sort of got like a nice Hollywood tan and, or anything like that. They're just, they look, actually the one word that a lot of people have used to describe the Men in Black is creepy. And that's a good way to describe them. They're kind of like the sort of person who, everybody's met a person, I think, in their life that you just get a really unsettling vibe from them. But that's what everybody gets from this sort of stranger category of Men in Black.
The thing that I find also interesting about them is that they can show up on somebody's door who's maybe had a paranormal sighting, even though that person has not reported that paranormal sighting to anyone.
No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of weird trends to the Men in Black reports that take it far beyond, the government angle. If somebody phoned the local airbase and said, reeled off this case and I'm going to go to the newspapers, well, then you could understand how 24 hours later, 2 days later, someone's going to come round, flash a card and say, hey, we want you to be a good American. This is a national security issue, but we don't want you to talk about it. That's very different from, you seeing, hypothetically, some sort of object over your backyard that flashes a beam of light down at midnight, and then you're woken up at 2 in the morning, and you open the door, and there are these 3 5-foot-tall guys, emaciated, pale, who look like, you want to give them a good meal. You know what I mean? And they're standing there. And what's interesting is that many people have said, if that happens, 3 guys stood in front of your front door at 2 in the morning, the last thing you're going to do is let them in. But that is what people do time and again. And it's sort of, the speculation is, and I think it's valid speculation, is that people have felt that their mind has been sort of rendered into an altered state, and their kind of common sense factor has been put on hold. And they do let the Men in Black in. They invite them to sit down. They patiently answer all the questions that the MIB have got. And then when the MIB are satisfied they've got all the answers, they sort of get in line and march off into the night and vanish. And then it's when they've gone, the person's like, well, why on earth did I even open the door at 2 in the morning and let them in? Why did I sit there and answer all those questions? Then it's like common sense slowly comes back to them. It's like coming out of a hypnotic state or something like that, or coming around from the anaesthetic after having, surgery or whatever. So, you get a lot of stories like this, which is clear. It's not Colonel Smith just coming out from the local Air Force base because he'd rather you didn't talk about this or that. I mean, the general motif, the original motif, is sort of really, really weird and creepy and, as I said, more occult-driven than it is, Mulder and Scully-driven.
Well, it throws a whole different, a perspective on everything, because I think most of the time people think, okay, well, there's us and then there's the government that has all the answers. But these Men in Black coming in, and I think people think, well, the extraterrestrials that are out there, they want us to know about them, so they're not going to, they're not going to go around threatening people. So I guess my question is, First of all, how do you think these folks have any? These Men in Black that you're talking about, the real Men in Black, they do have a tendency of showing up to somebody's house without that person maybe even telling anybody that they've seen anything. How does that happen?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, if your name gets splashed across your local newspaper, local guy sees UFO, then it's easy to get your name. If it's a town of only 2,000 people, and it's easy to find out where the person lives. But you're right, when nobody's actually discussed it with maybe just their wife or husband or whatever, that takes it down a totally different path. I wish I could provide the answer. All I can suggest is that the Men in Black turn up and know because they're part of the phenomenon that the witness saw. That's that's really the only way, the logical way to describe it, is that they're not there to investigate it. They're there to determine what you think of it and if you're going to stay silent or whatever. So I think, it's impossible for them to turn up at random, but it's very likely, I think, that they turn up because they're part of whatever it was that the person saw. And that, again, takes it away from the idea that it's the government angle. But as I said, don't get me wrong, there is a significant government angle, but I think they play up and they use the mythology of the Men in Black to cover their tracks. And that's why I think solving the mystery of the Men in Black is so difficult, because, when people say, is it something paranormal, is it something alien, or is it something government, I say yes, because, it's like, it falls in. It's not sort of something that can be firmly ascribed to this or that. It sort of melts over into different areas, I think.
Well, the thing is, I mean, most people do tend to think of the Men in Black as coming around if there's a UFO sighting or something like that. But if you're talking about the Men in Black coming around because someone saw a chupacabra or because someone saw the Mothman, then that sort of does change, you know, the notion that they're ETs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a classic example. I mean, one of the people who was very good about having his story told in The Real Men in Black book was Lauren Coleman. Lauren is without doubt, you know, the world's most famous cryptozoologist, you know, and certainly most respected cryptozoologist, you know, people who go out and investigate sightings of strange creatures. Lauren had his own run-in with a Man in Black after he was investigating not cryptozoology cases, but kind of like a weird crime-based story that sort of had analogies to the so-called Mad Gasser of Mattoon story, which is a very weird one, which goes off at another tangent. But, you know, so in other words, contrary to what people think, people in all sorts of realms of paranormal research have had run-ins with the MIB. I mean, I mentioned Men in Black encounters at Loch Ness. There was a researcher named Ted Holliday who was sort of, by his own admission, obsessed by the Loch Ness Monster mystery. He, in 1973, actually had an encounter with a Man in Black at Loch Ness who sort of vanished before his eyes. You know, it's like, how do you explain that unless all these phenomena are somehow interlinked? You know, so, I mean, I'll give you an even earlier example. You can go back to, for example, like the 13th, 14th, 15th century, when alchemy, you know, the sort of the transformation of base metals into precious metals like gold and silver. You know, people trying to understand the secrets behind alchemy. And there are a lot of stories, if you go back and look, of alchemists, you know, people dabbling in paranormal phenomena who are, you know, working in their little old cottage or something in some 15th century English village and got a knock on the door at midnight. They opened the door and there was a guy there in a black cloak sat atop a black horse who warned him not to dabble in alchemy. You know, it's kind of like there's not that much difference between, in the 15th century, somebody knocking on the door at midnight in a black cloak, sat atop a black horse, warning you not to dabble in the paranormal, and in the 20th century, somebody turning on your doorstep at midnight in a black suit with a black car outside, telling you not to dabble in ufology. You know, it's like the phenomenon's actually, I think, been with us for longer than many suspect, but it's sort of altered its sort of imagery to camouflage itself over the centuries, I think.
Well, that's interesting, and I wonder if you look at it from that point, if you can even go back further and I don't know, it's just kind of weird. Somebody drives up in a black chariot. I don't know, you know, in a black gladiator suit going, no. What is going on? And let me ask you this, because, okay, these entities, beings, things, they show up to people, and in terms of what you describe in your book, are they particularly benevolent, but at the same time, they're sort of threatening? Do they have what?
Well, I mean, what I would say to you about that is that, you know, there's nothing benevolent about the Men in Black at all. You know, absolutely nothing benevolent. They're very good at making threats. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But they very rarely follow through on the threats. It's kind of like if you stand up to them, it's like you almost interfere with their programming, and they're not sure what to do, and they sort of vacate the house quickly. You know, it's almost like the threat is almost kind of like theater, if you like.
Now that is interesting.
Yeah.
And that.
But of course, a lot of people.
Wonder.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't threaten them back because they put the fear of God into them. You know, that they do back down. But people who do stand up to them, you know, it's like the MIB sort of stammer and stutter, and you know, they just make their excuses and leave. So it's almost, it really does come across like a. It's basically, you imagine, some people actually said this. It's almost like the MIB. A kind of like, if you imagine the sort of MIB characters in the Matrix movies, you know, that sort of pursuing Keanu Reeves, they're not real, but they're like a program inserted, you know, into the imagery of the movie. And some people have suggested that the MIB are almost like a holographic 3D sort of program, and the program is 3 guys in black suits who threaten and silence people. And so the program is sent out to do its job, but when you stand up to them, it's like, Kaspersky or Norton has been screwed up, and the program has been infected, and the MIB crash. That's basically how some people perceive it.
It just seems so odd, though, that whoever has the intelligence, of course, to do all these incredible things, with even to create the hologram, is going to create a hologram of pasty-faced guys with ill-fitting suits and wigs.
Well,
why just go? Is that the best you can put together? You could create a hologram, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the best they can put together, but if you've got a guy who turns up sort of semi-friendly in an Air Force suit and says, "Hey, Mr. Smith, we understand you had a strange encounter, but we please, don't talk about it. We'd rather you didn't, because here's why. We're going to entrust you with a few details. It is a national security issue. We're not really sure what's going on, and we prefer people don't get in a panic. So would you mind not saying anything?" There are cases that have been along those lines, and even those have become, over the years, mutated into MIB cases. But if you have somebody turn up at somebody's house who not only is like 5 foot tall, a man who's 5 foot tall, looks like he weighs 100 pounds, his suit's falling off, and his skin is the colour of bottled milk, and he stands when he talks to you like within 4 inches of your face, and has got sort of menacing. As one witness, actually a couple of witnesses have said it in different ways, but they've said it's the effect they got from the MIB was it was almost like the way a dog looks at you when it's about to bite and you back away. If you're faced with that kind of imagery, that would be fairly intimidating. It may not be the best they could do, but if you get this creepy person who gives off a really unsettling bad vibe, just staring intently at you, as bearing into your brain and just looks odd and acts odd, that in itself might be enough to sort of, a classic case like turning the screw to the point where the person's like, okay, I'm just going to shut up,
You were going to say, were you going to say a little bit more about, you were talking about a gentleman that was a researcher or writer that had an MIB experience. Were you going to give us a little bit more fill in a little bit more on that?
Yeah, Albert Bender, you mean?
No, not Albert Bender. You were just recently talking about someone else that you were connected with or knew that had an MIB experience. I can't remember what his name was, because that you were going to maybe enlighten us a little bit more on that.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, there's a few. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. I have a friend named Marie Jones. Marie is a prolific author on paranormal stuff who lives in San Diego. And Marie and a friend of hers, back in the 1980s, they were setting up an alien abduction, sort of not so much a research group, but a sort of a support group for people who'd had abduction experiences and were quite traumatized by it. They actually found that the more they got into this and the more they encouraged abductees to come forward and try and help them, the more sort of hassle they got from these MIB characters. Marie's friend, for example, she lived in an isolated, sort of wooded, shadowy area. She reported or told Marie, I should say, of seeing these sort of shadowy, black-suited creatures sort of hovering around the fringes of the house, but clearly, ensuring that they were seen, just to sort of, frighten and intimidate Marie's friends. And Marie herself began to get classic aspects of another aspect of the Men in Black mystery, which is telephone interference. It's not just that they turn up on people's doorsteps. You pick your phone up, and people have reported like weird electronic bleeps and screeches and strange voices and weird languages. That just didn't seem recognizable as even any sort of terrestrial language. Marie would get these reports along the lines of this sort of creepy, almost like an electronic robotic voice, telling her which room in the house she was in, what she was wearing, what book was on the bedside table. And it really intimidated Marie and her friends to the point where, although Marie, as I said, is a prolific author to this day, and, still aggressively and vigorously investigates paranormal stuff, they closed down this abduction research group and walked away from it. And I think that was probably the intent of the MIB. So this is one example, of many where even people, in the research field have been visited. It's not always the witnesses. It's kind of like when you go looking for the Men in Black, it's almost like a light goes on, or some sort of detection equipment goes off, and they know that you're looking. And the more you look, the worse the chances are of them sort of paying you a visit. Then.
So nobody's knocked on your door at 1 a.m. in the morning, or did you just not open it yet?
Well, I've honestly never had that sort of weird knock on the door. But what I have had is very strange sort of telephone interference. Now, what is weird, and this happened on Coast to Coast, this happened on Whitley Strieber's show, and all these shows are archived, so you can actually listen to it when it was sort of happening live. On a lot of shows, when I was promoting my Men in Black book last year, we encountered numerous examples of telephone interference. And what was really weird is that the interference and the static would occur when we were talking about the telephone interference of the Men in Black mystery. It was almost like somebody was deliberately doing it to sort of try and provoke, either provoke intimidation or to say, hey, just to let you know, we're listening. Because, this whole idea that you see in the Hollywood movies, it's great for sort of building up suspense, but, to track somebody's phone number, you don't need to keep them on the line for 2 minutes like in the good old days to get the number. And a person would not know that you're listening in. There's none of this static and crackling and phones being put down, where you hear the click or whatever. That's Hollywood. That wasn't like that in the past, but that's Hollywood today. It's moved far on. So in other words, if people experience static, interference, etc., that is being deliberately added or being deliberately done. And I think it's been deliberately done to let the person know, to intimidate them, because you can't intimidate a person unless they know they're being watched. So you have to make it obvious, and I think that's what's going on. But, for me, I'm the sort of person where if there's clicks and noises on the phone, well, I'm not going to sort of curl up in a ball in the corner room and cry. That's going to push me on more to look for answers. Do you know what I mean? So it's sort of, it's going to have the wrong result from their perspective, I think.
Yeah, I'd be more apt to say hello, how are you myself.
Yeah.
Folks, I just would like to let you know that feel free to call in at this particular point in time, 877-572-4270. Give us a buzz, tell us your stories, and if you don't want to do that, please post a question or comment or observation in the chat room, and I will forward that to Nick. So please go ahead, and I'll be happy to do that as soon as you do that. All right, so back to some of these experiences and to the Men in Black. Now, some people think that they may be time travelers. And if that's the case, that's really not very encouraging, particularly if they're coming from our future, I don't know.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
If our future is a bunch of sort of humorless, skinny, pale-faced people who have nothing better to do with the time, it's like, the future's a bit bleak.
Yeah,
but
the future is now, people. The future is now.
Yeah. But, joking aside, this actually is quite a popular theory. One of the people I interviewed for The Real Men in Black book was a guy named Joshua P. Warren. Josh actually is a good friend of mine, and ironically, and interestingly, he actually lives in Asheville, North Carolina, that you talked about earlier.
Okay.
And Josh and many people have noted a very interesting thing. Everything about the Men in Black is kind of out of time. And by that, I mean that even today, in the 2000s, the Men in Black still dress like they did in the 50s, like the black suit, the skinny black tie, the fedora. Back in the 50s or 60s even, maybe even through the early 70s, nobody would think twice about seeing somebody walking down New York's Central Park or whatever in a black suit and a fedora. Today, you would certainly look twice, but you can go in any big store but still buy a fedora. So people would look twice, and they might, get home from work and tell the wife or husband, I saw this guy today in a hat, which you don't normally see, or that often. But the Men in Black, everything about their clothing is out of time. Even when people today report seeing their cars, they're like the old 50s, these sort of long 20-foot, well, they look 20-foot long cars, you know, with like the shark fin tails, totally black, and sometimes almost with like the white tires, that kind of thing. You know, the Men in Black and the cars they drive today, they sound like they walk straight out of the set of some 1950s gangster movie, you know, that kind of thing. And so, in other words, people have said, well, is it possible that the MIB are from the future and that there's been some sort of disaster in the future and they've only got sort of a limited range of knowledge of sort of the past? You know, we think we're all important today and, you know, our history is so important to us, et cetera, et cetera. But what if there was sort of some huge disaster in the future and there are only small fragments of the 20th and 21st century history left, you know, just literally bits and pieces, and they know that in the 50s and 60s people dressed in a certain way, so they kind of get the time frame wrong, and you know, and that would make sense. I mean, you look at fashions today, how quickly they turn up. I mean, give you an example. You imagine today you go out to a restaurant or something, and two guys walk in dressed like Crockett and Tubbs from Miami Vice in the 80s, you know, like a white jacket with the sleeves rolled up and a pink T-shirt. You know, you'd laugh, you know what I mean? But that was like 20 years ago, but fashions have changed so quickly. Or you go back to the flower power era of the 60s. You know, you see somebody like that today, they would stand out. But what if the Men in Black do have a limited knowledge of our background, and so they mess up because, you know, to them the 50s to the 2000s is nothing, but to us it's a lifetime. You know,
maybe they're not from the future. Maybe they're from the past. Maybe from that period. If let's say they're a hologram, for instance, and let's say during that period when so much was going on in this country and so many things were being explored, that as a hologram they were. I'm sorry, folks. I might just be going out here on a limb as I'm thinking, but you know, they were created and they, you know, obviously, and so they're coming actually from our past into our now, sort of. Do you follow me there with that, Nick? Does that sound too outrageous?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the very fact that you brought the sort of the sort of travelers from the past to mind, you know, it's just fit in with the idea of the future as well. And the reason both scenarios I think spring to mind is because everything about the Men in Black is out of time. But, you know, regardless of whether or not the time traveler theory has merit, whether it's from the past or the future, the fact is they don't dress like most people dress today. You know, it's not like they're dressing weird. There's nothing weird about the Men in Black, the way they dress. What they're doing, they're dressing historically. You know, and historically isn't weird. It's just different, and it's eye-catching and noticeable. So, yeah, you know, you could make both arguments that they're from the future trying to melt in with the past, but they've got it slightly wrong in terms of the years, or they're from the past because they're coming from an era when that's how people dressed, you know, and somebody back then developed time travel and, you know, the fact was hidden. So.
Well, I mean, it seems to me, though, primarily that they were obviously, they're not obviously human, and they are apparently able to disappear and appear at will. They don't seem to follow a certain kind of a logic in terms of their thinking. It seems like they have a directive and they go to the directive, and then that's pretty much it. If you stand up to them or you run away, then you throw them off, and they don't really quite know what to do. So they're an odd sort, whatever they are. It's like they're almost being a tool that's being used. The question is who's using them and what's behind them. And obviously at the same time, and I think that you already made this clear, the government also itself has decided to use that Men in Black phenomenon, and so they also, you know, they also are a part of it as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, this sort of really amplifies, you know, this whole idea of why it's so difficult to solve it. You know, people do assume the Men in Black are this or that, but you imagine, this is hypothetical and going out on a limb, but let's say you have these paranormal or alien MIB that really are sort of skinny, pale, 5'5" tall, and then you have the government people who basically imitate them to cover their tracks, And then you have people from the future who've got some limited knowledge of the past who feel that, well, we can travel back in time and cover our tracks by pretending to be these weird guys that were running around back then called the Men in Black. So you could ironically have a minimum, even an absolute minimum of like 3 different groups of Men in Black that everybody kind of, this is how our brains work. We try and lump everything together because it makes common sense. But maybe we should be looking at cases on their own merits, rather than trying to figure out, place it all under one banner, I think so.
Are there women in black, or are there just men in black?
No, thank God for women in black, there are.
We're not just talking about Elvira, Mistress of the Dark.
Well, actually, there are. I mean, some of them do kind of sound like Elvira or Vampira. I've actually got a cool Vampira T-shirt, but that's totally beside the point. But I mean, some of them. What's interesting, there are reports where people have been visited by women in black. I mean, it's ironic. You earlier mentioned about the Men in Black turning up or investigate Mothman and Chupacabra sightings. I've actually been on a number of investigations to Puerto Rico looking for the Chupacabra, and I went with a friend of mine in 2005 named Paul Kimball and his film crew. Paul has a film company in Canada. He lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The film company is called Red Star Films. And we went out to make a documentary called Fields of Fear, which was basically a study of the entire animal mutilation, cattle mutilation phenomenon, but with a significant portion on the Chupacabra. And when we were out there, we actually interviewed a rancher whose animals had been attacked by the Chupacabra, and he said that the day after the attacks occurred, and again, without him having reported to anybody, these 2 people turned up, basically started vigorously questioning him, and they were sort of dressed in black suits, very unemotional. One was a man, one was a woman. The guy was dressed in typical Men in Black gear. The woman was dressed in like a black business suit, the type that a woman in a professional capacity would wear. And they were very to the point. I mean, bear in mind, this was a little ranch, little farm type place in Puerto Rico, in a little tiny village with the jungle all around it, or the rainforest, I should say, 110 degrees or whatever. And these 2 characters turn up in black suits out of nowhere, and when they were satisfied they got all the answers, just walked off down the road, no cars, and literally walked into the rainforest. Now, this was just a guy, a rancher in this little village in Puerto Rico, who came forward because we put the word out beforehand that we were looking for people to speak. He wasn't looking for payment, wasn't looking for publicity, anything like that, just had an interesting story to tell, and yet it fitted in with this entire sort of 60-year legend and folklore of the Men in Black. So this was but it was made different by the fact that one was a woman, but she was described as unemotional, pale, and dressed in black. So she fitted that same category.
The whole concept is creepy, actually.
There's nothing
creepy.
There's nothing positive about it.
I can't fit it into, my whole, world view. It doesn't fit in neatly, for sure. I think that everybody would probably want to take a gander at that book. Is called The Real Men in Black, actually, because it would probably also at least open up the mind enough to a point where we realize there's so much going on that we just can't really wrap our minds around. Let me see what else I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah, so did you find anything about the Chupacabra while you were there? You talked to the guy, and did you see the animals, the mutilated animals, and did you come away with any evidence about this creature?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is what I talk about where, for me, collecting reports from witnesses is the most important thing because, forget the researchers, forget the investigators and the authors, even the authors. The most important people are the witnesses because without the witnesses, we've got literally nothing to go on. So they are the most important people in this entire field. And it's important to collect and analyze witness reports. But for me at least, some people might disagree, but for me at least, you have to go to the other step as well, the next level, and that is actually to get out there and look for these things and try and find them. And that's what, we did with the chupacabra, that unfortunately, no, I didn't see it on I've been to Puerto Rico now on a number of occasions. But, if you're going to go, you've got to go for like a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. You've got to get yourself out into the field. You've got to sort of make the acquaintance of the villagers in these little isolated towns, etc. Gain their confidence, to where you can, buy them a beer in the little bar in town or whatever, and so they know, you're being honest and genuine. You're just looking for data. You're not looking to exploit them or whatever, and that's what you have to do. And sort of as a result, I've had the opportunity, very fortunate opportunity, to speak to ranchers, police officers, veterinarians, members of the public, farmers, you name it, who've had experiences, and these experiences went from, for example, a woman named Norca, who I interviewed the first time I went there in 2004, who'd seen this chupacabra-like creature literally stood in the road as far back as 1975, that was sort of intimidating, almost goading her to sort of, drive towards it, and she didn't, just slammed the brakes on and stopped until it basically just glided into the sky. So that was like
into the sky? You said glided into the sky.
Yeah, just sort of rose up almost like a helicopter. So that was like a member of the public. I've interviewed ranchers who, showed me evidence of animals just, mutilated and killed. I spoke to veterinarians who talked about animals drained of significant amounts of blood. When I went with Paul Kimball, the guy I mentioned earlier, in 2005, we interviewed a former civil defense employee on Puerto Rico who, when he worked for the Civil Defense Department, he investigated literally dozens of chupacabra attacks, and he put together like this huge file dossier, which was like 8 inches thick. And fortunately, when he left, when he retired, they let him take it with him, and he showed it to us, and it was kind of like, you imagine you're the sort of person who's like into crafts and whatever, you put together sort of like a scrapbook. It was like that. But you imagine sort of a 6-inch thick scrapbook full of official reports of chupacabra attacks and photographs. That's what he got. And, collectively, when you've got all this sort of material, no, I didn't unfortunately see the chupacabra or encounter it, but, each time I've been there, I've come away convinced that whatever it is, it's very, very real, and the people there, take it extremely seriously.
Is Puerto Rico the only place where that occurs? It also occurs in the Southwest, American Southwest, does it not?
Yeah, I guess it depends how you define what the chupacabra is. The classic scenarios of the chupacabra are animals attacked, mutilated, and drained of significant amounts of blood, and the creature looks sort of devilish. Well, you can go throughout history and find creatures that were devilish looking and that were sort of predatory, drinkers of blood. You can go back into like ancient Roman and Greek legends and ancient Babylonian legends. All of these cultures and civilizations had stories of sort of vampire type creatures. There's nothing sort of new and profound about me revealing that on the radio. It's almost like the chupacabra is like a modern day equivalent of some of these earlier ones that existed, however long ago. And so, in that respect, at least, when people say, "Well, is the chupacabra seen here, there, and everywhere?" It is, but I think chupacabra is like a cultural modern day term for a very old mystery. There are reports from England back, centuries ago, where farmers would wake up and find their cattle, with puncture wounds on their necks, and it was put down to the work of fairies. You go back to ancient Rome and Greece, they had stories of legends of the creature known as Strix, which again was a very similar type creature, often described with sort of leathery type wings, which is something attributed to the chupacabra in some cases. So, I think the term chupacabra, the word, if you like, has become like a piece of pop culture. But if you take away the name, there's not that much difference between that and phenomena that's been around for as long as, recorded history has been around.
Are these mutilations precise? They're different from the cattle mutilations that people talk about. Yeah, they're not the same.
No, that's a very good question, because, cattle mutilations, they're sort of tied in with precision, scientific advanced technologies, black helicopters. We're clearly talking about something technology-based. The Chupacabra attacks, I'm not exaggerating, we're literally talking about 2 puncture wounds on the jugular vein of the neck and blood drained, the classic vampire-type scenario. When I went to Puerto Rico the first time in 2004 with a good friend of mine from England named John Downs. John, he's probably Britain's, he's Britain's sort of most well-known cryptozoologist, studier of unknown animals. Well, John actually went to Puerto Rico for the first time in 1998 and flew from Puerto Rico onto Mexico, where there had been similar attacks. John actually went into one little town where, and this sounds like straight out of a horror movie, but I swear to you it's the truth. The people in this little town had painted crosses on their front doors, and when the sun set, they would not come out. They bolted those doors and windows shut tight. In other words, this is, to back to your point, this is very different from the cattle mutilations. The similarity is animals are killed and blood and organs are removed. But the differences are that one seems to be technology, highly advanced technology-based. The other one seems to be linked with, just unknown creature-based, if you like.
That's really amazing. I tell you, there's just so much that we don't know in this world. And to talk about these things, I think most of us in our daily life, we read about it and, research it or whatever, but to really hear about people that have actually had direct experiences. Whole town's not going to paint crosses on their door and lock themselves in unless there's something there.
That's like some old Bela Lugosi movie or something,
Yeah, that's really pretty fascinating. Questions, comments, or observations, listeners, people in the chat room, please feel free. Now, we talked about the Men in Black and your book, that new book, but you've got another one that's out already as well called The Pyramids and the Pentagon. Now, and you must be writing all the time. What do you write every day? Is that what that is? Because I can't imagine someone so prolific.
Well, the Men in Black book came out about a year ago, so this is sort of like a year down the line. But in terms of writing, people think that I write 24 hours a day. I actually don't. A lot of authors kind of enjoy writing late at night. They get kind of inspired when the sun's down, and they crank it out then. For me, I don't do. I like to sort of keep to what I call regular hours. I usually start about 7 in the morning, and I work till 5 at night, Monday to Friday, and that's it. I'll finish the sentence or the paragraph or the chapter, if it's 5 or 5:30. And then I switch off and then just hang out and, I do just stuff that sometimes people find it surprising. I sit back and watch American Idol, NCIS, I just do normal stuff, go out with friends, have dinner, drinks, go to see a band or whatever, and I like to do the sort of 7 to 5, Monday to Friday, take evenings off and take weekends off, unless I'm doing publicity stuff or whatever, of course, like lectures and conferences or radio, TV, that sort of thing. But for me, I work best by keeping it in that sort of rigid format. And, of course, if you're working 7 to 5, Monday to Friday, just writing books, that's 50 hours a week, and you've got the data and the information that you need, you've done the interviews, it's actually not that difficult time-wise to crank out a lot of stuff. It's 50 hours is a lot of time, even if it's just Monday to Friday, 7 to 5, and nothing else. So, that's kind of how I do it. And when you sort of just sit there, you're not sort of being interrupted, and it's literally just 10 hours of typing every day, 5 days a week. It's you can get a lot done. So.
I guess you could. Now, the Pyramids and the Pentagon, was that one of your ideas, or is that one of those that came more from your publishers, or something that you guys decided on jointly?
No, that was actually my idea, but they had a few ideas as to some of the things that they wanted in there, but I came up with the theme of the book. The whole issue, the book basically is like a study of the ancient astronauts, or like the History Channel's Ancient Aliens series.
Right.
The idea that, that our culture in thousands of years ago, or centuries ago, was visited by advanced entities from somewhere else that sort of highly influenced not just our cultures, but, our architecture with pyramids and stone circles, that sort of thing. But I've been interested in this phenomenon for decades. Since I was a kid. Back, in the late 70s, when I was buying books by Eric von Daniken and people like that, Chariots of the Gods. But the whole reason why I never wrote a book about it until now is because I didn't feel I had anything that new to say. It's like, what's the point of just rehashing von Daniken or whoever? It's just, it's cheating the reader, it's cheating yourself, and there's no point to it. But one of the things I found over the years that nobody had really written about, but I started to get snippets of data on, and that I was able to, dig more and more to where I was able to do it to a full-length level, was what government agencies knew about the whole ancient aliens angle, ancient astronauts. And that was a subject that, in terms of book length, hadn't been done before. The idea that, never mind just Chariots of the Gods type scenarios, but that the Pentagon was investigating it as well. So the more I dug into these stories, the more I got data. That's basically the theme of the book. It looks at, for example, the Pentagon's search for the truth about Noah's Ark and what Noah's Ark is or isn't, and does it really exist on Mount Ararat. Was able to determine that the CIA had launched an investigation into, of all things, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Defense Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Navy were heavily interested in the 50s in the idea that the pyramids of Egypt and massive stone formations around the world elsewhere were built using some sort of like anti-gravity or levitation technology. So this is basically the theme of the book, sort of the Pentagon and the military, not just of the US, but the Germans in the Second World War and the British, looking into the mysteries of the past, largely to try and determine if these ancient technologies and phenomena could be somehow weaponized, and utilized in some fashion on the battlefield today and in the future.
I don't know if you know that there is a replica of the Noah's Ark in Holland somewhere. This gentleman put a lot of money and time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was talking to a friend about it, and of course the whole notion of two of everything just still boggles, the mind. Yeah. What sort of things do you touch upon in the book when you talk about Noah's Ark?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the story of Noah's Ark, I mean, a lot of people assume that the story of Noah's Ark is like a standalone story of this guy Noah who got a message from God to build this huge ark and get 2 by 2 of every animals, load them on, as soon as you can because this almighty flood's going to turn up, literally almighty flood. But a lot of people don't realize that pretty much every culture and country around the world.
And Nick will be back shortly. You wait for his connection to resume. There you go. You back?
Yeah, you got me?
Yep, I got you.
Hello?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, that must be the Man in Black. That must be.
I guess so. Hello, guys. Okay, so what were you saying?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, a lot of people assume that when it comes to Noah's Ark, that it's like a standalone story that appears in the Bible, and that's it. However, if you look pretty much into every culture and country around the world, thousands of years ago, each and every one of them has a legend of a flood, and they have a legend of their own deity telling somebody in their country to build a huge boat and get as many animals on board as you can to survive this cataclysmic disaster. It's not just, the story, of Noah's Ark. I mean, that is actually just sort of the biggest distortion that you could possibly imagine, and people assume it is just something of, sort of literally, sort of biblical proportions, but actually isn't. Even Native American Indians, they talk about their deities telling, their people to build large canoes and, sort of populate them with animals. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, for example, talks about a huge flood. I mean, the story is actually told today, is told on a bunch of tablets dated from 650 BC that basically tell this story about a man named Utnapishtim who builds a huge boat aboard which he and his family and numerous animals survive a catastrophic flood. So, this is a very similar story. Now, what's interesting, though, is that as far as the Pentagon's concerned, the reason they became interested in the story of Noah's Ark was that in 1949, a U.S. Air Force spy plane was flying towards Russia, the former Soviet Union, I should say, specifically on the border with Turkey. They were going to photograph, like a high-altitude photographic mission, to film a new Russian military base that was being built in the area. And they used Mount Ararat, where supposedly Noah's Ark landed, as like a guiding point, to know that they were on the right track in terms of approaching this base. But as they flew over Mount Ararat, one of the crew members reported seeing this, or said he could see this, what looked like a huge wing sticking out the ice. Now, Mount Ararat is very, very high. For most of all year round, the top part, the peak, is just covered by ice and snow permanently. One of the crew members reported seeing this, like a 200 to 300 foot long wing-like structure sticking out of the ice. So the crew turned and photographed it, got pictures of whatever this was, and actually reproduced one of them in the book, and it looks like some sort of artificial formation sticking out of the ice. And in terms of the Pentagon, they never actually called it Noah's Ark. Officially, within the CIA, the Army, the Defense Intelligence Agency, it became known as the Ararat anomaly. And what's interesting is that one of the theories that was pursued was the idea that what if it wasn't just a large old wooden boat? What if it was like a crashed UFO built by aliens that actually stored not sort of 2 by 2 of every animal, which would have been incredibly difficult, How would Noah have sort of been able to sort of shuffle 2 fully grown man-eating lions onto an ark? How would you do that? It's impossible. But what's interesting, if you go back and read the original translations of a lot of religious texts about animals put on these arks, they don't talk about 2 animals being taken on the ark. They talk about the essence of the animal. Or, in other words, it's almost, as some people have suggested, perhaps like a DNA preservation, which would make far more sense than, the sort of cumbersome, highly risky idea of, trying to pull by the neck, on a rope, 2 animals on board your ship and put them into a cage or whatever. But if you're talking about like the essence, or as some people said, the spirit of the animal, some researchers have suggested this sounds like a DNA collection program, kind of like when husbands and wives, they're trying to have babies and they can't, so they preserve the eggs or the sperm or whatever, and then down the line, they're pulled out of cryogenic frozen storage and you have artificial insemination, that sort of thing. Well, maybe that would make more sense. These huge arks acted as preservation centers for DNA in the event of a worldwide cataclysm, which possibly aliens were able to foresee was coming, and so they took steps and actually helped the people on the planet to preserve significant amounts of life, and did so in such a way that it then provoked all these stories and legends of arks, directed by God or whatever.
Well, now that you're saying it that way, I'm like seeing, the earth covered in water, and there's like a whole bunch of different boats out there from different, particular civilizations, different cultures. Did they ever find out whether or not that was what it was? What is on Mount Ararat, though? And has it ever been?
The one that the Air Force took photographs of, the biggest problem of all is that the Turkish government is very reluctant to allow people, anyone, right up to the very peak area where this thing is encased and buried in the ice. What we do know, because former CIA people have come forward, is that the CIA in the 50s and the early 60s sent up the U-2 spy plane to actually photograph the area. Interestingly, none of these pictures have ever surfaced. The only pictures we actually have from the Pentagon are these 1949 photographs. You can actually find them online now. The Defense Intelligence Agency's website, there's like a selection of them. The 50s and 60s photographs have never surfaced. And ironically, some people have said they were the clearest of all, which, perhaps that's not a surprise why they haven't surfaced. But we do know that the CIA was deeply interested. We also know that some of the people, the CIA who were interested in the 50s and 60s, were also people who were also analysing photographs of UFOs sent to the CIA by members of the public, which in itself is kind of intriguing. So, I mean, one of the things that sort of makes a mockery of the idea that the CIA wasn't involved, I mean, the CIA's official angle is that, well, you know, maybe a couple of people years ago, decades ago, in their spare time after work, had an interest and they may have used, you know, CIA computers or cameras to sort of look into this. But we didn't really look for it. It wasn't an official CIA project. But that's sort of made a mockery of by the fact that through some of the files that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, I'll give you a classic example. There's actually a directive in one of the scientific intelligence files from 1975 which talks about how an author had got a new book out about Noah's Ark, and he was promoting his book at like a book display at a shopping mall in Washington, D.C. in 75. And there's actually a directive in one of the files where the CIA's scientific intelligence people ordered two of their guys to go out, like, you know, in plain clothes, jeans and T-shirt or whatever, and check out the display and the book and see what the author was talking about, you know, to the people who are coming along to listen to his little speech in the bookshop. So, you know, it's kind of, and he actually says in the files, you know, if we do this, it will help us perhaps answer some of the questions about what was described as the Ark problem. Now, as I point out in the book, if the CIA hasn't had a serious, realistic search for Noah's Ark, why are they sending personnel out undercover in plain clothes to listen to what authors of books on the subject are saying, and why are they even referring to it as a problem in official files? You know, that in itself opens another can of worms. Why, for the CIA, was this weird thing on Mount Ararat a problem? But evidently it was. But the other problem is that, you know, we're sort of limited in how many files and documents we've got. You know, it's sort of just a few bits and pieces here and there. The bigger files sort of still remain classified.
Well, I suppose if they found and they were able to you know, discover what it was and make it public, it would either ratify, you know, the Bible or ratify people's particular faith, or, you know, maybe there's something in there for them with that, or possibly, I mean, who would not be fascinated to see exactly what the Ark was and what's inside of it and how it was structured?
No, I actually think that a lot of the sort of religious stuff that the government investigated, that one of the reasons for the silence was related to either what they did find, thought they were going to find, or had a fear of finding. Now, if, you know, this is, granted it's hypothetical, so we don't know the full story. If they proved from all their analysis that what this thing was, this so-called Ararat anomaly, was a 600-foot-long sort of fossilized boat, you know, made of wood, then that would probably lead to a huge increase in people following Christianity, because the government has just vindicated these old stories. But what if they went up there and actually found it was some sort of rusted old metallic craft filled with highly advanced technologies? By default, by revealing that, you've just kicked a big hole in part of the entire history of Christian doctrine and teachings. So it's kind of like, I'm not saying that is what they found, but if that's what they found, you can understand the secrecy, because much of American society, you know, is driven on Christianity. What would happen if it was actually proved that a lot of these stories are based around ancient alien visitations? The best thing the government would probably do would be sit quiet and say nothing, because it would literally not be able to tell the story without it causing uproar and possibly even a collapse of significant percentage of society, you know.
Well, I think that is definitely an argument that a lot of people use for the government to be silent about these things. So you actually think nothing, as far as you know and as far as your research has indicated, nothing further is really known about whatever this structure is?
My personal conclusion, based on what we know, based on the files, the issues that were brought up, and the fact that the area itself, as far as we know, there are a few rumours of sort of like Delta Force type guys clandestinely checking it out, but none of this has been verified. What we are able to verify is that the CIA, the Air Force, the Defense Intelligence Agency have all analysed photographs of this so-called Ararat anomaly. They've all got copies of the pictures. They've tried to determine what it is. And like us, they're normal human beings. They have their own theories, some of which are sort of reinforced by their own beliefs about religion or non-beliefs. But I think the Pentagon probably, as far as we know at least, I could be totally wrong, but as far as we can tell from what we know, what's in the public domain, I think they're as much scratching their heads today as they were back in the 50s. They know there's something weird up there, and it's been reported and seen in the area where, according to the Bible, Noah's Ark came to rest. But I don't think they have complete answers beyond that. They're still scratching their heads, I think, to try and figure out, well, what does that actually mean, in the long term?
I don't know, man. It seems like to me that, unless, I guess there's different levels to secrecy and different levels to the government. Yeah. So obviously, go ahead. Well,
the big thing to stress is that this is in somebody else's country. This is not like invading Baghdad. Turkey is part of NATO. So in other words, you can't just invade this country and say, well, we want to know what it is, we're coming in, like it or not. This is a country who's a friend and an ally. And if they say, look, this is private land, it's kind of like, let's say, a Turkish satellite films something weird on, Mount Hood. And then, the Turkish government says, well, we want to go up Mount Hood for the next 6 months, and we're going to send over our military and government. The U.S. government would soon say, hell no,
No, yeah.
Unless you've got, but it's the same the other way around. The Turkish government doesn't want everybody and his brother going into their country. So that's one of the reasons why, it's just the logistics. It's in somebody else's country, that's why the answer hasn't been found.
I suppose that's true, but we could find a couple of extra, $300 or $400 million to toss the Turkish government. Now, I'm sure they'd appreciate that. They couldn't help us as much as we could help them. But, all of that aside, somebody probably does know what that's about. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think there's far more known. Whether one of the things I talk about in the book is a story about, the idea. I'll give you a good example. Back in the 50s, the FBI was heavily involved with investigating a man named George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel was a man who claimed alien contact, wrote a number of books, and developed a huge following. And he said that, that his research had shown that Noah's Ark actually was, the legend was born out of like a huge alien spaceship that acted as like a repository for, collected specimens of animals on the Earth. The FBI watched him for years. Their file on him runs to 400 pages and covers like 15 years. So I'm pretty sure, that there are people in government who know more. Whether they have all the answers or whether they have fragmentary answers, that's the bigger question. But whatever the answer is, they've not reached the public domain yet. They're still buried, behind closed doors. So.
Right, and that's the shame, actually, of it. Yeah. But I'm sure that'll happen in time. Also in the book, you talk also about crop circles and at the NSA and what is the link actually between the NSA and crop circles and this whole 2012 thing?
Yeah, one of the things that, as I point out, the main theme of the book is government agencies taking an interest in mysteries of the past. And, of course, one of the most relevant mysteries of the past that's sort of really in a lot of people's mind in the present is the whole 2012, December 2012, is the world going to end kind of scenario. Now, if you go back and you look at the original Mayan prophecies, etc., which, talk about something significant happening on December the 21st, 2012, the original Mayan prophecies, contrary to a lot of people think, they don't talk about the world ending, or huge tidal waves, earthquakes, or comets slamming into the planet. Nothing like that. They actually talk about it being the end of an era in the human race. Now, yes, you can interpret the end of an era being, sort of something slamming into the planet, 100-foot tidal waves, civilization being destroyed and having to start again. Or, as some people think, could it be like a cultural, spiritual, or, sort of mind-based shift, in the way people think and their attitudes to civilization and the planet and everything else. Is it kind of like an age of enlightenment, not an age of destruction? The problem is, we don't know. The problem also is that, it's quite over the years, there have been changes in like the Gregorian calendar. Years weren't 365 days at one point. I mean, that's a fact. So we don't really know if December 21st, 2012 is the year and the day and the date when something's going to happen. But nevertheless, government agencies have taken an interest. Now, one of the things, I'm originally from England, and certainly going back to the early 1990s, when the whole crop circle phenomenon kicked up really big time. I used to go down to Wiltshire, the county, more than any other in England, where the crop circles used to appear. And interestingly enough, Wiltshire is also home to Stonehenge and the famous Avebury Stone Circle as well. So it's like a magical, weird county. Most of the little villages and towns haven't changed for centuries. It's kind of like going into a Harry Potter movie or something like that, literally. But it's where nearly every year most of the crop circles, probably a good 95% of them, turn up in the county of Wiltshire. In the last decade or so, more and more more and more formations that have appeared in the fields have had sort of a theme of like a 2012 theme. The idea that whoever's creating these formations or whatever's creating them is sort of getting us to think about the idea that it's, something significant to happen in just 6 months from now even. And there were people in the NSA who had different views. Some of them thought, it was like a paranormal phenomenon that was warning us or preparing us for some sort of prophecy to come true. Interestingly, there were also people in the NSA who actually believed, and this is like a really sort of wacky, far-out theory, but, it's not one we can entirely dismiss. It was actually a theory that the NSA heard rumours of and felt obliged to investigate it. The idea that there were people, like sort of radical terrorists, who were hiring human crop circle makers to create 2012 theme formations to kind of like provoke fear and anxiety in the general public. That's the whole point of terrorists, is to provoke fear. And, the idea was get the general public thinking that the end's around the corner because we live this lifestyle and we live this belief system or whatever. And, that by doing this, not only does it create fear, but it suggests the idea that, our lifestyle's wrong. And, in other words, the terrorists were using sort of like a subtle disinformation scheme, exploiting the crop circle phenomenon, kind of like the government exploited the Men in Black phenomenon to hide there's a real phenomenon, but you exploit it as a means to an end. But I mean, for me, whatever the answer to that question is as to whether or not, people were exploiting the mystery, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there's a genuine crop circle mystery of paranormal origins. There's absolutely no doubt about that at all. The big question is it aliens? Is it some paranormal phenomenon? Is it, one of the interesting theories is the whole Gaia theory, the idea that the Earth itself is a living entity. And, when this infestation, the human race, that sort of damages the planet, when it gets to a critical point, the planet starts sending messages out, and could it do that in kind of like the form of crop circles? It's kind of like that movie, The Happening, where, nature fights back by, it's that M. Night Shyamalan movie where people around the world start killing themselves. The human race starts committing suicide. Their minds have been affected, and it's nature fighting to destroy that destructive form creation known as a human race. Maybe crop circles are the planet, screaming out, enough's enough, who knows?
That's not, that's an interesting idea. It's a very interesting concept, as a matter of fact. So you visited some crop circles yourself, and you stood in the middle of them, and you picked up on the energy and all of that?
Well, I mean, I think the thing I've picked up on more than anything else, and this is probably something that you don't get unless you visit them. I'm not saying I'm anything special because I visited them, because I'm not. But what I would say what you really get from visiting the crop circles or the pictograms, these far more elaborate formations, is not just the intensity and, you know, the brilliance of the design, but it's the sheer size of these formations. You know, if you look at a photograph in a book, where you got like a 3x4 color picture, yeah, it looks cool. But when you actually get out there and you find you're standing in this massively intricate formation that is like the size of 2 American football fields end to end, and it appeared within 2 hours in pitch black darkness overnight, and it is so sort of architecturally, you know, sort of geometrically correct and precise, and it stretches, you know, 3 times the distance the average footballer could kick a ball, maybe more. That, for me, stands out more than anything. It's almost like what I've never been there, but I would imagine it's what it's like standing at the foot of the Great Pyramid at Giza in Egypt. You know, you see it on pictures, but when you're at the bottom of it, it's just sprawling upwards in front of you. That's kind of what you get with the crop circles. It just blows your mind to see how big and precise these things are.
Did you feel anything specifically, energetically, or just, or that's what you felt?
Well, I did, and I kind of felt, you know, your hairs rise on your arms, etc. But, you know, for me, was it because something weird was going on, or was it because the sheer spectacle of how can this be? Do you know what I mean? Or was it a bit of both? You know, who knows? But I mean, what I would say, I've spoken to people who've had like intense headaches cured. They've had sinus trouble cured by going into a crop circle and things like that. So.
Wow, that's all pretty amazing. So also in your book, you also touch upon Atlantis. And are you, because you mentioned earlier that you thought perhaps, or you talk about perhaps, or there is a theory perhaps, that Noah's Ark was a spaceship. Now, do you mention at all in your book the fact that some people feel like Atlantis itself may have been a spaceship?
Well, I don't so much talk about that, but I mean, I do talk about the idea of, you know, ancient astronauts, if you like, kind of coming down and sort of giving assistance to, you know, the early cultures on our planet. And maybe that might explain why some of these stories of things like legends like Atlantis, where, you know, that we're clearly, most of the legends of Atlantis aren't talking about aliens. They're talking about highly advanced cultures, human cultures, you know, whereas you might have one country that was just at sort of caveman primitive level, and then, you know, let's say in Europe or somewhere, and then, you know, like the cavemen in, I don't know, Scandinavia. But then you had in the Middle East, you know, Egypt or somewhere, people building massive pyramid formations in the same time period, and yet they're two vastly different cultures. So my personal theory, if you like, and granted it is a theory, is a lot of these stories about advanced cultures like Atlantis were born out of one or two things, or a combination of the two. Perhaps ancient extraterrestrials coming to the Earth and giving assistance to the people of that era, and, you know, kind of kick-starting their civilizations to where you suddenly had these cultures going from massively primitive to suddenly having the ability to move, you know, 100-ton stones into place across miles. So I think that's, for me at least, I think that's what's going on. I think we're seeing human-based cultures given massive assistance by something outside. And the reason I mention this in the book, you know, is because dozens of books are being written about Atlantis, but one of the things I talk about is references and documentation concerning how Edgar Cayce, very famous prophet of the 30s, 40s and 50s, who basically sort of prophesied and talked about a lot of ancient things like Atlantis. I talk about in the book how the CIA secretly was able to install agents in his headquarters out at Virginia Beach. So, you know, in other words, we had this guy, this prophet, talk about Atlantis, and the CIA deeply, deeply watching his every move and listening to his every word.
That's really fascinating because, again, what do they want from all of this? Obviously, there's stuff that's going on within that word that we call the government, where they have knowledge, and it's either that they're amassing it or they're trying to find out the same things that we're trying to find out obviously they have the ability to probably get more and also keep more secrets as well. So it would really be great one of these days if we could have some clarity on that.
Well, yeah, you're right.
And Nick, I'd like to thank you for being on the show because we're actually reaching that point right now. And I, really, really enjoy talking to you. I want to let people know that you can go to nickredfern.com and find out more, or you can also go to nickredfern14.blogspot.com. I'm just Googling.
That's actually the better one. I'll tell you for why. A lot of people don't realize this, but the nickredfern.com one was actually set up by someone, and not me. I didn't set it up. It was actually set like a tribute fan. They haven't updated. It hasn't been updated by them for a long time. So the best one is if people go to nickredfern14, FORTEAN.blogspot.com or nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. People can find all about me there, and I'm always happy to chat and answer questions. I don't keep people hanging on for weeks to reply. I'm not one of these sort of ego-driven authors who don't talk to me types. I'm always happy to chat, and people can reach me at my Facebook page at the blogs as well. And again, always happy to chat and answer questions and hang out with people. So.
Fantastic. Thank you a lot, Nick. Have you guys heard of the mysterious town of... Welcome back to the show.
David, how's it going?
It's going pretty good, and it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, first of all, I'm rattling off the titles to all these amazing books, and you've got two that we can be talking about now, but you also happen to have a third one that's also coming out, and that is, what is it, Weird World? Is that something like that? The world's weirdest places.
Yeah, it's basically the publisher. What often happens is the publisher, rather than me come up with the ideas, the publisher themselves actually come up with the ideas for the books. And they said, they were looking to have. They do like a series of books. They did the world's creepiest places and the world's most haunted places. And they asked me if I wanted to do the world's weirdest. And so basically, it's a study of 25 places around the world that are sort of like a magnet for just weird activity. In other words, it's not a weird place because somebody happened to see Bigfoot there once. But if somebody saw Bigfoot, somebody else had a UFO encounter, there's a famous 3 or 4 ghost stories, there's something else, to where the place itself is like the beacon for strangeness. That's the theme of the book, sort of 25 places around the world where, there's just never-ending strangeness going on. And that one will be out round about October, I think, something like that.
That's just amazing. I mean, so they actually give you the ideas for the books, or all the time, or are there some books particularly that you say I have to write?
Yeah, I mean, the Men in Black mystery, that's one that really sort of fascinates me, and I've written a couple of books about that and working on another one, and so that was one that I came up with. But, I mean, I'd say it's probably 50-50, where, I probably submit to publishers every year, probably somewhere in the region of like 10 or 15 book ideas. And of those book ideas, probably 2 or 3 get accepted. And then they sort of toss their ideas back and forth, and I send my suggestions back. We kind of bang it into shape. It's kind of like a band recording 20 songs for their album, and then they trim it down to 12. It's kind of like that sort of thing, that you go with the ideas that seem best, and where, I have sort of several criteria when writing a book. You don't want to, even if you're doing something like an old mystery, you don't want to go over old ground. You want to be able to give the reader something new. I don't want people to pick a book up and say, well, hang on, I've just read all this, condensed from 15 different books. You want to be able to give them new data, even if, like with the Men in Black, it's an old mystery. So that's one of the things. And also, you just want to try and stay fresh, and uncover new cases and material. So, don't just go over old cases but with a new theme, but actually, sort of dig out new stuff. That's why, I don't kind of do like the A to Z of abductions, because what are you going to do? Just reel off all the cases that are already in print anyway, it's like, what's the point? So, quite a bit of writing for Penthouse. I did quite a bit of feature writing for them on all sorts of things. But basically, some of the stuff I did for Penthouse, I did a sort of a lengthy article from about 2 years ago called Sex and the Supernatural, which was basically like a study of people who claim to have had like sexual type encounters with ghosts and paranormal entities, kind of like incubus and succubus type stories, that kind of thing. It was like a sexual component, not, sort of hot babes coming back from the dead or anything like that, but unfortunately, but no, it's more along the lines of, sort of the paranormal aspects of when people talk about these kind of, experiences, etc.
So since you've been writing all this time, and since you started, and particularly since you started writing about the paranormal, and from that point till now, describe for me what is your feeling about, and what kind of change, well, first of all, how has it changed you?
Well, I'm not sure it's changed me. I think it's probably given me, obviously, more of an appreciation that the world around us, that there's far more to it than we think there is. It's not just sort of black and white. You get up, you go to work, you come home, you watch TV, and go to bed. There are sort of realms and forces and dimensions, however you want to term it. There's things around us that sort of exist on the fringes of society that would become classed as the paranormal or the supernatural. And, I'm firmly convinced they exist. So I think rather than changing me, it's given me an appreciation that there's more to be found than just what we see in front of us. But I think in terms of change, there have been changes. I mean, in one sense, that when I first got involved, for example, in the UFO field, UFOs, when I was sort of 11, 12 as a kid, UFOs were alien spacecraft and et cetera, but the more I've kind of dug into it, I'm pretty much more convinced nowadays that rather being literally sort of extraterrestrial, these entities, whatever they are, possibly more likely to coexist with us in kind of like extra or interdimensional windows, that kind of thing. Now, that doesn't, by definition, they're still alien in the sense that they're non-human, but I kind of take the view that, there seems to be a lot of parallels with, ancient mythology and folklore of like supernatural entities coming through gateways and doorways, some other magical realms to our existence. And back then they were viewed as like goblins and pixies and whatever, and now today we put like an alien spin on them. But I sometimes wonder if nobody, whether it's in the 1500s, the 8th century or today, if we actually have a full understanding of what these entities are, but other than the fact that they're coming from somewhere else and they interact with us. And it's kind of the same with Bigfoot, and that's my other big interest is cryptozoology, the study of unknown animals. Again, when I first got into it, I just thought, well, Bigfoot's just some sort of ape that science hasn't classified or identified yet. But there are a lot of weird Bigfoot-type cases as well, like Bigfoot vanishing in the flash of light, or footprints suddenly coming to a halt as if,
how long now have you been writing?
I actually started in 1982, which was, scarily enough, 30 years ago this year. I'm 47 now, and I started at 17. And basically what happened was I was pretty much useless at school. I was one of these kids that, I was great having a great time with all my friends and whatever, but, when it came to lessons and class, I was not the greatest student at all, and didn't get good grades, nothing like that at all. No college, university for me. I just left at 17, typical, me and all my friends were sort of like, the typical gang on the streets, you know what I mean? What are we going to do? You've got to find something to do. And I went down what in England at the time called the job centres, where all the jobs are advertised. And I had no clue what I wanted to do. But there was a new magazine starting up, not too far from where I live, called Zero. And it was basically going to be a magazine for teenagers, covering everything like music, fashion, TV, all sorts of things, that would sort of appeal to teenagers. And it said, no experience necessary, we'll train you in every aspect of journalism, photography, page layout, design, interview techniques. And I thought, well, this sounds much better than pushing buttons in a factory or, being told what to do all day long and getting stuck in traffic on the way to work, because it was literally just like a mile from where I lived. So, I thought, well, this sounds like a good job, and it sounded an interesting and alternative job. And so I did that, went along for the job application, actually got the job, amazingly, and did that for about 2 years. And then I thought afterwards, when the job came to an end, because it was like a limited contract run, I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And for a few years, I just went back to sort of regular jobs because I just couldn't, I was still like young and green, and I just didn't make much of an inroad into the world of journalism. I just went back to sort of regular sort of like warehouse work, forklift driving, van driving, did that for sort of 4 or 5 years, but still did freelance writing during that period. And then as I got more and more leads and inroads and networking with people, I got to the point where I thought, well, hang on a minute, I'm actually now starting to be able to do this as a career. Granted, even, back then and even today, not like some people think, you're living in the Hollywood Hills with a Ferrari or whatever. Freelance writing is a tough, struggling world to be in. It's fun. You're your own boss, but, no one's ever going to get rich off it unless you're really, J.K. Rowling or Stephen King. But I enjoy what I do, and that's always been the case. So I started off from there, doing more and more work and in all sorts of fields, which I still do today. I don't just do paranormal writing. When you're a writer, it's kind of, again, to make like a band analogy. Somebody wants to book you for a gig, you go where the gig is. So that's what I've done all that time,
right.
Basically. So.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how you can tie Bigfoot into Penthouse magazine, but
you have to be very skillful. I mean, I actually did Creature had just disappeared. There are stories about cameras, malfunctioning when people try and photograph these things. And again, I'm more inclined to think today that Bigfoot and all these different cryptids, that's what they call the unknown animals, all of these things seem to be tied in. There are a lot of UFO cases where Bigfoot and other creatures have been seen, not just at the same place, but at the same time. So I kind of, today, think there's like a bigger picture that's where all these quote things, if you like, which is the best way to describe them, kind of fall into different aspects of a larger phenomenon that we're still struggling to get to grips with. So in other words, I don't think I've changed as a person, but certainly my views have changed over the years the more I've dug into all this.
Since we're talking about cryptids, just a question that just came into my mind about Nessie, of course. Do you believe that that's an actual, do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster, or have you done any research into that?
Oh, yeah, I've been to Loch Ness. I mean, when I used to live in England, Britain itself is actually quite a small country. I mean, right now I live just outside Dallas, Texas. England, Scotland, and Wales combined are actually smaller than the entire state of Texas. That's how small the British Isles is.
Yeah.
So, in other words, travelling from England to Loch Ness, Scotland, actually is no different from sort of, taking a trip from like LA to San Francisco. You can do it in a day or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, Loch Ness is a cool place to hang out. And, I do believe that, there's a phenomenon that has become known as the Loch Ness Monster. What it is, I mean, that's the big question. Some people suggest the idea of a surviving plesiosaur, a Jurassic, basically a prehistoric reptile. I mean, it's an interesting theory. The only problems are that, plesiosaurs were saltwater animals. They lived in the oceans. Loch Ness is freshwater. Loch Ness, some people have said, well, these creatures look to be sort of 15 to 20 feet long. And if they're flesh eaters, is there a viable enough fish population in Loch Ness to survive a colony of animals, maybe 20 or 30, of 20 to 30 feet long possibly, and is there enough fish to feed them every day? It's sort of these critical questions that, even for me, push some of the Loch Ness stories again down the paranormal path. I mean, Loch Ness is a very weird place. I mean, none other than Aleister Crowley actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which was actually later owned by Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. And Crowley actually did all sorts of various incantations to summon up demons. There have been UFO encounters over Loch Ness, Men in Black encounters even on the shore of Loch Ness, sightings of sort of large, weird-looking black cats. You name it. There's been ghost encounters. You know, again, Loch Ness is like a beacon for weird activity. So if it was just the Loch Ness Monster, I'd be inclined to say, well, yeah, maybe it's some sort of surviving creature from the past. But tying it in with all this other stuff, you know, and again, you have to wonder, because there are also cases of people trying to photograph the Loch Ness Monster and their cameras jam at the crucial moments. It is almost like, you know, you're dealing with a creature that seems flesh and blood, but on the other hand, seems to have like paranormal overtones to it as well.
It does seem amazing that people somehow can never really come out with a clear picture of, you know, these, you know, cryptozoological creatures. When what they described they saw, it seems very plausible for the most part, and they're very sure about it, but somehow that they never really come out with that definitive picture. Do you think we're going to ever get to see, do you think that this question is going to be resolved, say, in our lifetime?
Well, I mean, I would hope so, you know, but I think, you know, you can look back at not just through the UFO field, which began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold. You know, I'm sure young guys and women then who sort of set up UFO clubs in the early 50s were sure they were going to get the answer in the 60s, you know. Most of those people aren't left anymore now, sort of 60 years. And not to sound depressive, you know, but it's just a fact. You know, 60 years later, there aren't many of them left. 100 years ago, you know, people were engaging in things like seances to contact the dead. People are still doing that today because we don't really have the answers. So I would like to think we're going to get the answer, but if you ask me honestly, if we look at the trend that's gone on in the past, these mysteries have perpetuated and, you know, the human lifespan hasn't, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of it is going to be dependent on persistence, you know. If we don't continue looking, searching and, you know, going on these quests, I know for sure we won't get the answers, but I think it's going to take some sort of alternative thinking, or one of the things I've found is that if you just investigate stuff, you end up with a lot of files, a lot of research, you know, a lot of places, you know, certainly files and filing cabinets 20 years ago. Today, you know, endless amounts of memory space taken up and CDs, you know, to save all your files on, or thumb drives or whatever. But and reports are good, you know, there's nothing more important in the subject than the witnesses. You know, these are the most important people. But just investigating stuff and collating stuff isn't enough. I've found that you really need to try and experience the phenomena for yourself to try and get the answers. And I think that's an important thing. Don't just be an investigator if you want to find the truth. You've got to become part of interacting with the phenomenon if you can.
Well, now that's a tough question, because how does one, you know, do that? Let's take you, for instance. Now, you've been doing this for a while. What has, if you don't mind sharing, what's been the most paranormal experience that you've had? Well,
I mean, I'll give you a good example, David. I mean, one of the areas that interests me a lot is the subject of tulpas. I don't know if you know what tulpas are, or if your audience does, but basically, a tulpa is the idea that you imagine that, you know, you focus in your mind on an image. It's actually a Tibetan term, tulpa. You imagine you focus in your mind on one particular image. Let's say a large black cat with glowing red eyes, like a 7-foot tall supernatural black cat with glowing red eyes. You focus on that image in your mind,